January 1944. A thin layer of frost clung to the wooden roofs of Camp Concordia in the Central Plains of Kansas. Dawn had only begun to push a pale orange line across the horizon, yet the camp was already awake. American guards, wrapped in thick winter coats, stamped their boots against the cold ground while the kitchen staff hauled metal trays of freshly baked bread toward the dining hall. The smell drifted across the yard, warm, rich, unmistakably abundant. Along the fence line, a group of newly arrived German prisoners of war, most captured in Tunisia only weeks earlier, stood silently watching the scene. They expected starvation. They expected punishment. They expected the cruelty they had been told awaited them in American hands. Instead, they watched as other prisoners, fellow Germans, walked freely across the yard, hands in pockets, chatting casually, heading toward a breakfast line that looked more like a workers' cafeteria than a wartime compound. One of the newcomers stared at the bowls of oatmeal, the stacks of bread, and the tins of fruit being carried inside. He whispered to another prisoner, almost not believing the words as they left his mouth. "This is America?" What they saw that morning was only the beginning, an introduction to a system unlike anything they had imagined, and one that would challenge everything they believed about the enemy. When German soldiers were captured in North Africa in late 1942 and early 1943, most believed they were being taken into a hostile and dangerous captivity. For months, German propaganda had insisted that Americans were undisciplined, vindictive, and culturally inferior. Men who knew little of Europe and even less of the proper conduct of war. Prisoners expected harsh treatment, perhaps even brutality. They had no reason to imagine anything else. Yet the United States had entered the Second World War under a very specific legal and moral framework. Long before the first German POW ever set foot on American soil, the War Department had already aligned its policies with the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. Washington understood that millions of American troops would soon be fighting across Europe and the Pacific. Fair treatment of enemy prisoners was not only a matter of principle, it was a form of strategic insurance. The more meticulously America complied with international law, the stronger its moral position would be when demanding the same for U.S. prisoners held by Germany and Japan. But morality was not the only factor at play. Geography, logistics, and industrial capacity made the United States uniquely suited to hold large numbers of POWs safely away from the front lines. By mid-1943, the North African campaign was ending in a decisive Allied victory. Over 230,000 Axis troops, German and Italian, laid down their arms as the Afrika Korps collapsed in Tunisia. Britain, suffering from bombings and food shortages, could not absorb the growing prisoner population. The United States could, and so, in a matter of months, thousands of POWs were quietly loaded onto transport ships near Bizerta and Tunis and sent westward across the Atlantic underguard. The long voyage was a moment of uncertainty for the prisoners. Many assumed they were being transported to labor camps, mines, or industrial plants where survival would depend on strength and luck alone. Rumors filled the lower decks. No one knew what waited beyond the ocean. When the ships reached American ports, New York, Norfolk, Boston, New Orleans, the first impression stunned many of the prisoners. The docks were intact. Civilians walked freely. Shops operated normally. Food was everywhere. There was no rubble, no ruins, no signs of war carved into the skyline. While Europe burned, the United States appeared to function in almost surreal normality. From these ports, trainloads of POWs were dispersed across the vast American interior. Camps were built in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Nebraska, Georgia, and dozens of other states. By 1944, more than 400 camps and branch camps spanned the country. Many were placed in rural areas, far from towns, surrounded by open land, where escape attempts were unlikely to succeed simply due to distance and climate. The first nights inside these facilities revealed the magnitude of the difference between expectation and reality. German soldiers discovered barracks with heating, electric lights, blankets, and organized sleeping quarters. They saw medical stations staffed with U.S. Army doctors. And, most shocking of all, they received meals that exceeded not only the standards of the Geneva Convention, but in many cases the quality and quantity of the rations they had eaten in their own army. To Americans, this system was simply an extension of the country's industrial capability and legal obligations. To the prisoners, it bordered on unbelievable. Local reactions varied. Some communities worried about housing enemy soldiers so close to their homes and farms. Others viewed the POW camps as a source of much-needed labor, especially after the agricultural workforce thinned due to millions of men serving overseas. But for the War Department, the system was functioning exactly as planned: humane, orderly, and strategically beneficial. Still, the question remained: why were the conditions so generous? Why did the United States choose not to mirror the harsher policies used by other nations? The answer was multidimensional, rooted in law, logistics, public perception, and a broader vision of American ideals. Understanding this framework is essential because it shaped everything the prisoners would experience in the months and years ahead. And to grasp how these policies manifested inside the camps themselves, one must explore the deeper backdrop that defined the American approach to captivity. The American approach to handling German prisoners was shaped not by improvisation, but by a deliberate system designed months before the first POW arrived. The U.S. War Department understood the scope of what was coming. The North African campaign alone would yield tens of thousands of prisoners, and future operations in Sicily, Italy, and France would add even more. To prevent chaos, the United States built a structure rooted in predictability, discipline, and a surprising degree of respect. At the heart of the system was a simple philosophy. If America upheld its obligations, the enemy would have no justification to mistreat American troops captured overseas. This logic was especially urgent given the rising number of U.S. forces fighting across Europe and the Pacific. Every American tank crewman captured in Tunisia, every pilot shot down over France, every sailor taken prisoner after a naval battle. Each one depended on the hope that the enemy would observe the same Geneva standards America practiced. But another crucial factor shaped the POW system: capacity. The United States possessed something almost no other major power had during World War II: land, food, and industrial abundance. By 1943, wartime production had reached levels unmatched anywhere on Earth. American factories produced more trucks, canned goods, uniforms, boots, medical supplies, and construction materials than entire continents combined. Feeding, clothing, and housing POWs was not a question of scarcity. The challenge was logistical, not material. Food, in particular, highlighted the contrast between nations. The U.S. agricultural sector remained intact throughout the war. Fields were never bombed. Silos were never emptied by invading armies. Trains carrying wheat, corn, beef, and milk traveled freely across the country. Even with rationing at home, Americans lived far better than civilians and soldiers in most countries at war. For the military, providing prisoners with meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit required almost no strain on supply lines. At the same time, the United States faced a labor shortage. Millions of American men were now overseas. Farms struggled to plant and harvest. Factories needed hands. The presence of German POWs offered a lawful, organized solution. Under Geneva Convention rules, prisoners could perform non-military labor, receiving small wages and guaranteed protections. For American farmers, the arrival of POW work crews often meant the difference between a lost season and a successful harvest. Yet material abundance alone does not explain the cultural shock experienced by the prisoners. Beneath the logistics lay a deeper divide: the social atmosphere of the United States versus the militarized environment Germans came from. Many POWs had grown up under Hitler Youth indoctrination, strict discipline, and a rigid hierarchy. The American style of authority, less formal, more practical, and often unexpectedly friendly, was alien to them. Guards were not required to shout. Officers did not deliver ideological lectures. Rules were enforced but with a degree of humanity that many Germans initially interpreted as weakness. Over time, however, they recognized it as confidence, an ease rooted in a society not consumed by total war or political fear. Even the landscapes where the camps were built left a lasting impression. POWs found themselves surrounded by endless farmland, open fields, small towns, and quiet rail lines stretching across the country. They had imagined something harsh and intimidating. Instead, they were placed in the heart of a nation that, while mobilized for conflict, remained physically untouched by destruction. American propaganda contributed another layer. Unlike the totalitarian style used by the Axis, U.S. information policy was subtler. The government wanted German prisoners to see America as it was productive, orderly, and stable. Allowing POWs to witness everyday life in small towns, farms, and local businesses served a strategic purpose. It encouraged comparisons. It challenged their assumptions about the enemy, and it planted seeds that would grow after the war ended. Of course, not every prisoner accepted what he saw. Hardline Nazis viewed the humane conditions with suspicion, calling them illusions designed to weaken their loyalty. But even they could not deny the visible contrast between the world inside the American camps and the collapsing reality of the Reich. This mixture of capacity, policy, and cultural exposure formed the foundation of the POW experience, one that would shape every aspect of daily life once the prisoners settled into their new reality. And it was within this environment, stable yet unfamiliar, that the most striking differences between German expectations and American practices would soon reveal themselves. For the German prisoners arriving in the United States, the first shock was the sheer abundance and quality of food. The rations provided were far superior to anything many had eaten in their own army. Whereas a soldier on the Eastern Front might subsist on a thin soup, stale bread, and occasional canned meat, American POWs were served multiple hot meals a day. Breakfast often included oatmeal, eggs, bacon, and fresh fruit. Lunch and dinner offered meat, potatoes, vegetables, and dessert. Even small luxuries like butter and coffee were provided consistently. The difference was not merely quantitative. It was also a matter of planning and presentation. Mess halls were organized efficiently. Metal trays and dishes were clean, and cooks prepared meals in massive kitchens designed for thousands of men. For many prisoners, the first sight of steaming bread loaves and bowls of fruit created disbelief. Some wrote letters home, describing the food as luxury or fit for an officer's table. Beyond shock, the nutrition had real effects on health and morale. Prisoners gained weight, recovered from previous malnutrition, and even experienced improvements in digestive health. Doctors in the camps noted that proper nutrition reduced illness and injury. For the Americans, feeding POWs adequately was practical. Healthy prisoners required fewer medical interventions, and strong prisoners could contribute labor on farms and in factories. The contrast with life in wartime Germany only heightened the prisoners' astonishment. Reports of scarcity, rationing, and bombed-out cities were common in letters and diaries. And for many Germans, this experience of abundance bordered on disbelief. The reality of plentiful food in a war zone challenged deeply held assumptions about the enemy and reshaped perceptions in subtle but lasting ways. Alongside the food, German POWs were equally stunned by the degree of personal freedom afforded to them. Within the camps, movement was regulated but not oppressive. Prisoners could walk through the grounds unescorted, participate in sports, attend libraries, and even receive mail from home. Camp life was structured, yet contained elements of autonomy almost unheard of in Europe's wartime prisons. Organized recreational activities played a central role in the daily routine. Soccer matches, basketball games, and even amateur theater productions were encouraged. Educational programs taught English, math, and vocational skills, providing mental stimulation and purpose. For soldiers who had spent years under rigid military discipline, this combination of structure and freedom was disorienting. Social interactions with American civilians also occurred under controlled circumstances. Prisoners occasionally worked on local farms or assisted in community projects, fostering human connections despite the circumstances of war. These interactions were carefully managed to prevent propaganda or security risks, but they gave the prisoners a glimpse of everyday American life, its openness, politeness, and normalcy. Even small details, such as access to newspapers or reading materials, contributed to a sense of autonomy. Many POWs reported feeling surprised at being trusted and initially suspected hidden motives. The freedom extended beyond mere physical space. It was a psychological shift that challenged the prisoners' expectations of captivity and instilled a subtle respect, or at least bewilderment, toward their captors. Labor was another angle where the American POW system displayed both ingenuity and compliance with international law. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could perform non-military labor but had to be compensated fairly and treated humanely. In the United States, this system became an essential tool for addressing labor shortages caused by millions of men serving overseas. POWs worked on farms, harvesting crops, and tending livestock, often earning small wages paid in scrip usable within camp facilities. Some worked in state-run or military-operated workshops, contributing to non-combat production such as textiles, repair work, and infrastructure maintenance. The work provided purpose and routine while also benefiting local economies struggling under manpower shortages. From the prisoners' perspective, labor was initially met with suspicion. Many expected grueling, punitive tasks. Instead, they found organized, supervised work with sufficient breaks, protective clothing, and adequate supervision. Germans accustomed to forced labor in their own occupied territories were frequently amazed that their labor was respected and compensated. Work also served a social function. It provided opportunities for interaction among prisoners and between prisoners and Americans. Over time, relationships formed based on mutual professionalism and, occasionally, mutual respect. Though constrained by security measures, the labor program reinforced the impression that captivity in the United States was not only humane, but intentionally structured to maintain dignity and health. Despite the leniency in daily life, American POW camps maintained strict yet subtle security measures. Fences, guard towers, and roving patrols were standard, but they were often surprisingly unobtrusive. Many prisoners were initially shocked to find open fields, low fences, and the absence of heavily armed sentries in some camps. Escape seemed almost possible, yet the reality of geography and logistics made attempts largely futile. Camp administrators understood a critical psychological principle: trust reinforced order. By giving prisoners responsibility for maintaining barracks, participating in work programs, and following schedules without constant supervision, the Americans reduced resentment and resistance. The POWs' surprise at this trust often turned into cautious respect. For the Germans, raised under authoritarian discipline, the implicit acknowledgement of responsibility was almost unheard of in wartime captivity. Escape attempts were rare and largely symbolic. Geography played a key role. Many camps were located hundreds of miles from major cities, across harsh farmland, forests, or swampland. Additionally, language barriers, unfamiliar terrain, and climate, all compounded by the awareness of inevitable pursuit, kept most prisoners compliant. The perception of freedom within the secure environment became a defining feature of camp life, further contributing to the cultural shock experienced by German soldiers. Not all prisoners responded the same way to American generosity. Within the camps, divisions emerged between die-hard Nazis and prisoners who had grown disillusioned with the regime. This ideological tension shaped daily life and complicated camp administration. Hardline loyalists were initially hostile to Americans, viewing the humane treatment as a subversive tactic designed to weaken morale. They resisted work assignments, rejected recreational opportunities, and attempted to influence fellow prisoners to maintain Nazi ideology. Conversely, less committed soldiers gradually adapted to the system, participating in classes, sports, and work programs, often quietly questioning their previous assumptions about the war and the enemy. Camp officials became adept at navigating these tensions. Officers implemented measures to isolate troublemakers, promote neutral or pro-American activities, and prevent ideological indoctrination from spreading. Over time, these efforts created a microcosm where the majority of prisoners came to accept, if not embrace, their unusual circumstances. The ideological conflict highlighted a broader truth. Human behavior is shaped by environment as much as belief. The contrast between rigid expectations and humane treatment forced prisoners to confront the dissonance between propaganda and reality, fundamentally altering their perception of the enemy nation. Beneath the surface of humanitarian policy lay a subtle psychological strategy. By providing comfort, nutrition, and freedom within strict limits, the U.S. leveraged POW treatment as a form of soft power. Letters sent home from prisoners praising the camps served as indirect propaganda. These accounts reached Germany through both official and unofficial channels, sowing doubt among soldiers and civilians about the integrity and effectiveness of Nazi leadership. The humane treatment was also intended to minimize hostility, reducing escape attempts, rebellions, or sabotage. A prisoner who feels respected and cared for is more likely to comply, participate in labor programs, and follow camp rules. American administrators recognized that efficiency, security, and morality were not mutually exclusive. They reinforced one another. This angle of psychology was particularly effective because it exploited expectation versus reality. German POWs had been conditioned to anticipate deprivation, harsh discipline, and propaganda-filled indoctrination. When confronted with food, leisure, and relative freedom, their worldview was challenged, leaving them both disoriented and reflective. Over months, this treatment subtly reshaped perspectives, sowing the seeds for post-war reconciliation and the eventual integration of some former POWs into American society, or, at minimum, fostering enduring respect for the principles of humane treatment. These angles collectively reveal the multi-layered experience of German POWs in the United States. Nutrition, freedom, labor, security, ideology, and psychology all intersected to create an environment unmatched anywhere else in the world during the war. By late 1944, the German prisoners at camps across the United States had settled into a rhythm of daily life that few could have imagined when they first arrived. They had become familiar with the routines: breakfast in the mess hall, work on local farms, midday rest, afternoon recreation, evening studies or games. For many, the initial shock of abundance and freedom had faded into a quiet disbelief, an uneasy acceptance that this was reality, not illusion. The decisive moments came during the holiday season of 1944, a time when the differences between American and German expectations became most pronounced. Christmas celebrations were organized in nearly every camp. Trees were decorated, cards were exchanged, and special meals were prepared, often including turkeys, fresh vegetables, and desserts. Prisoners who had endured years of wartime scarcity and propaganda-driven fear were suddenly invited to participate in a tradition that emphasized generosity, community, and normalcy. One officer at Camp Papago Park, Arizona, documented the reactions. The men were stunned. Many could not believe that an enemy would take the trouble to celebrate a holiday for prisoners. Some wept quietly at the sight of fresh fruit and meats we had not seen in years. Letters sent from the camp back to Germany described the scene in disbelief, emphasizing the surreal nature of their captivity: warmth, cleanliness, and kindness coexisting with the fact that they were still prisoners. Alongside these festive moments, inspections by the Red Cross and military authorities reinforced the credibility of the system. German delegates noted proper sanitation, medical care, and adherence to international law. The reports, sometimes circulated within Germany, contradicted official propaganda, which portrayed American captors as cruel and untrustworthy. For prisoners, these inspections validated their experience and deepened the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. The psychological impact of these events cannot be overstated. Prisoners who had anticipated hostility were confronted with systematic benevolence. For some, the shock provoked resentment toward the Nazi regime that had prepared them to expect mistreatment. Others experienced guilt or moral confusion. How could their country wage a war so destructively abroad while their captors treated them humanely at home? The Christmas period also highlighted the influence of American leisure and education programs. Cultural events, theatrical performances, and organized sport competitions demonstrated that the camp experience was more than mere survival. Prisoners found themselves participating, observing, and sometimes enjoying aspects of life that had been entirely absent in their previous military existence. The tension reached its peak when news from Europe began filtering in. By late 1944, Allied advances had taken Paris, Antwerp, and parts of the Rhine. Reports of bombings in German cities, shortages, and civilian suffering contrasted starkly with the prisoners' own conditions. For German POWs, the gap between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. Those who remained ideologically rigid found themselves challenged by the comforts and freedoms they were living each day. It was in this period, during routine life, punctuated by festive celebrations and news from home, that prisoners began to question not just their immediate circumstances, but the broader assumptions of loyalty, propaganda, and national superiority. The combination of humane treatment, material abundance, and exposure to American culture constituted a turning point in the mental and emotional experience of captivity, a climax not defined by battle or conflict, but by profound psychological and cultural revelation. The stage was set for the final phases of the war, when the contrast between life in America and destruction in Germany would force prisoners to confront reality more directly than ever before. By early 1945, the contrast between German prisoners' expectations and their daily reality had grown stark and undeniable. Reports from the camps circulated quietly among prisoners, often read aloud in barracks or mess halls. Letters home described comfort, freedom, and abundance, provoking disbelief among soldiers who had never experienced such treatment. The psychological tension within the camps reached its peak as prisoners began to grasp the wider context of the war. The turning point was most vividly felt when news of Germany's deteriorating situation reached the POWs. Cities were being bombed relentlessly. Civilians faced starvation and displacement. Many prisoners realized that while their families endured destruction and deprivation, they themselves were living in a controlled, abundant environment far from the front lines. Letters from home, filtered by censors but still conveying fragments of hardship, heightened the contrast. Prisoners responded in varied ways. Hardline Nazi loyalists maintained discipline, attempting to enforce ideological adherence among their peers. Yet even they could not fully deny the reality before them. Soldiers who had once believed that America was cruel and uncaring now faced an uncomfortable truth. The enemy was capable of order, generosity, and humanity. Diaries from Camp Hereford in Texas describe the disbelief of soldiers seeing American civilians distributing candy to prisoners or arranging festive meals for men who had fought against them only months earlier. One of the most telling moments occurred during spring 1945 when Red Cross parcels arrived containing chocolate, cigarettes, and other luxuries. Prisoners gathered in small groups, unwrapping the packages in silence. Many wrote in astonishment, "We had been told to expect nothing, yet here is abundance." The psychological effect of these gestures, simple, everyday acts of provision, was profound. It blurred the line between captor and host, authority and caretaker, enemy and benefactor. Work assignments continued to serve both practical and psychological functions. Prisoners participated in agriculture, infrastructure maintenance, and vocational training, often receiving recognition for their diligence. The experience of contributing to a community that respected them, rather than exploiting them as subhuman labor, challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about wartime treatment. Throughout this period, American officers observed the reactions carefully. They noted changes in morale, compliance, and interaction among prisoners. Those who had initially resisted recreational activities or labor gradually integrated into camp life. Trust, once cautiously extended, became part of the daily routine. The American strategy, combining legal adherence, material comfort, and controlled freedom, proved effective in minimizing unrest while promoting order and cooperation. By May 1945, as Germany formally surrendered, the transformation was unmistakable. POWs had internalized the reality of American power not just militarily, but socially and culturally. They understood that the enemy they had feared, disorganized, vindictive, and brutal, was in fact disciplined, resourceful, and strategically superior. Many would carry this revelation with them long after repatriation, influencing post-war perceptions of the United States and shaping narratives of reconciliation. This period represented the culmination of the American POW experience, a turning point where expectation met reality, where ideology collided with human decency, and where the quiet, controlled power of abundance and freedom became a force more transformative than any battlefield encounter. The experiences of these men, their shock and adaptation, set the stage for understanding the broader consequences of humane captivity and the unexpected role it played in reshaping attitudes, both during and after the war. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked the official end of hostilities in Europe, but for thousands of German prisoners in the United States, the war continued in a different form. The camps remained operational, housing men who, until recently, had been soldiers, yet now confronted a new reality. They were no longer part of an army in combat, but participants in an extensive program of rehabilitation, observation, and repatriation planning. The immediate challenge for American authorities was logistical. Tens of thousands of POWs awaited transport back to a country in ruins. Ports had been damaged, railways disrupted, and cities flattened by bombing campaigns. Many prisoners had become accustomed to American routines, from the quality of meals to the daily freedoms granted within camp boundaries. Some were reluctant to leave, hesitant to return to uncertainty, scarcity, and the destruction evident across post-war Germany. Letters and diaries from the time record the uneasy feelings of men torn between loyalty to a defeated homeland and appreciation, or even gratitude for the humane treatment they had received. Communities near POW camps also experienced significant effects. Local farmers, who had relied on prisoner labor for crops, witnessed the sudden disappearance of a dependable workforce. Yet in many cases, bonds had been quietly formed. Some POWs had learned English, built friendships, and participated in small community projects. The interactions fostered understanding, and in certain towns, German prisoners were remembered positively long after repatriation. For the prisoners themselves, the aftermath involved a complex emotional and social negotiation. Those who had adhered strictly to Nazi ideology often returned home with profound disillusionment, having observed the stark contrast between American lawfulness and the collapsing dictatorship in Germany. Others carried with them a more practical sense of how a society could function efficiently and humanely even amidst global conflict. The disparities in treatment, combined with knowledge of the destruction in their homeland, often provoked reflection on the morality of warfare and the value of humane conduct, even toward an enemy. Military assessments of the POW program further highlighted its success. Escape attempts had been minimal, compliance with camp rules was high, and productivity in labor programs exceeded expectations. The War Department noted that humane treatment had not led to disorder or rebellion. In fact, it had reinforced cooperation. The experience became a model, studied in subsequent years as an example of practical, lawful, and strategically effective prisoner management. Additionally, the post-war experiences of these men influenced broader reconstruction efforts. Former POWs who had observed democracy and freedom in America carried insights about social organization, governance, and civilian life. Some returned home motivated to participate in rebuilding Germany along more constructive, law-abiding lines. These long-term consequences underscore the subtle yet significant impact of humane POW treatment. one that extended beyond immediate logistics to shape perceptions and actions for decades to come. By the summer of 1945, the camps began closing in stages. Transport convoys carried prisoners to ports, ships crossed the Atlantic, and men arrived in a homeland marked by devastation, scarcity, and social upheaval. The transition was not without difficulty. Psychological adjustments, ideological conflicts, and the stark contrast between American abundance and German deprivation created challenges for returning soldiers. Even so, the groundwork for reflection and reconciliation had been laid. The memories of humane treatment, plentiful food, and personal freedoms inside American camps became a lasting reference point for many prisoners, challenging wartime indoctrination and shaping the narratives they would carry for the rest of their lives. The experience of these POWs, their astonishment and adaptation, naturally leads to examining the broader social, psychological, and political consequences as they reintegrated into post-war Germany. As repatriation progressed through late 1945, German prisoners returned to a homeland fundamentally altered by years of total war. Cities lay in ruins, transportation networks were fractured, and millions of civilians faced shortages of food, clothing, and shelter. For many returning soldiers, the contrast between the order, abundance, and humane treatment they had experienced in American camps and the devastation awaiting them at home was striking, even disorienting. Reports collected from repatriated POWs reveal a mixture of relief, gratitude, and cognitive dissonance. Some were eager to reunite with family, yet struggled with resentment at the hardships their loved ones endured while they had lived comfortably abroad. Others openly questioned Nazi leadership, expressing disbelief that their country had permitted such destruction while they themselves had been treated with dignity by the enemy. Diaries from former POWs describe this as a period of profound psychological adjustment, bridging the gap between years of militarized indoctrination and the realization that humane treatment, even in war, was possible. The experiences of these POWs also left an imprint on post-war German society. Those who returned with exposure to American norms, orderly infrastructure, functioning democracy, fair labor practices, and personal freedoms became subtle carriers of new ideas. Some went on to participate in Reconstruction efforts informed by observations of American efficiency, fairness, and governance. Communities and local governments, encountering these returning soldiers, occasionally witnessed shifts in expectations, with veterans advocating for orderly, lawful, and humane practices that contrasted with pre-war or wartime norms. The legacy extended to broader U.S. German relations. Letters and oral testimonies from former POWs highlighted American generosity, feeding both official diplomatic narratives and informal perceptions. Many German soldiers described being surprised and humbled by the treatment they had received, framing accounts that countered entrenched propaganda. Over time, these personal stories contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the United States among post-war Germans, creating channels for reconciliation that extended beyond formal treaties and Reconstruction programs. At the same time, the American communities that had hosted POWs reflected on the experience with their own mix of pride and introspection. Farmers who had relied on prisoner labor often remembered the relationships formed with men who were once enemies. Camp staff and administrators regarded the program as a validation of strategic planning and moral discipline, demonstrating that humane treatment could coexist with effective security, labor productivity, and national defense priorities. Military analysts later cited the program as a model for lawful, efficient prisoner management, an example of wartime pragmatism aligned with moral principles. By 1946, most POWs had been repatriated. Camps closed, leaving behind orderly barracks, libraries, and recreational facilities. Physical remnants of the program faded, but the psychological and cultural consequences endured. German soldiers returned home with first-hand experiences of enemy decency, abundance, and freedom. These experiences challenged ingrained wartime assumptions, reshaped personal perspectives, and, in subtle ways, influenced post-war society. The aftermath of the American POW system underscores a key insight. Victory in war is not measured solely in territory gained or battles won. In the case of German prisoners in the United States, strategic planning, humane treatment, and cultural exposure produced consequences that outlasted the war itself, altering perceptions, attitudes, and human understanding in ways that no battlefield alone could achieve. This legacy sets the stage for reflection, offering a window into how morality, logistics, and psychological strategy intersected in one of the lesser-known but profoundly significant aspects of World War II. The story of German prisoners in American camps offers a unique lens through which to understand the complexities of war. It is not a tale of battlefield heroics or grand strategy, but of humanity exercised under extraordinary circumstances. In a world defined by destruction, deprivation, and brutality, the experience of these POWs revealed the quiet power of generosity, order, and respect. Prisoners, initially filled with fear and suspicion, discovered that the enemy could provide sustenance, freedom, and dignity without compromise. Simple acts, a warm meal, access to a library, permission to play soccer, or the opportunity to work and contribute, carried profound consequences. They challenged assumptions, reshaped loyalties, and forced reflection on the very nature of warfare. The German soldiers' astonishment was not merely at physical comforts, but the moral and psychological weight of decency. That a nation at war could treat captives not as subhumans, but as human beings deserving of care. This approach had ripple effects beyond the camps themselves. Many POWs returned to a devastated Germany with new perspectives, carrying lessons in organization, fairness, and humanity. For the United States, the program demonstrated that compliance with law, combined with careful planning and the projection of moral authority, could be a form of strategic influence, soft power in action. The treatment of POWs became a subtle instrument of post-war reconciliation, sowing seeds of understanding that persisted in personal narratives, diplomacy, and cultural memory. Ultimately, the experience of these men serves as a reminder that war is never purely about weapons, tactics, or territory. It is also about choices that define character, shape perception, and leave legacies far beyond the battlefield. In the quiet halls, green fields, and orderly mess lines of American POW camps, history reveals that the exercise of decency, even in war, can transform both captor and captive, creating echoes that endure long after guns fall silent. The shock of abundance, freedom, and humane treatment experienced by German POWs is not merely a footnote in history. It is a testament to the enduring human capacity for compassion, strategy, and foresight amid the chaos of war.